The bitter cold of the Wyoming winter night pierced through Josephine Campbell's tattered dress as she stumbled through the snow, her vision blurring with each labored step. She had been walking for hours after the stagecoach had left her behind at the last stop, a cruel trick played by a driver who had made advances she'd firmly rejected. With no money and nowhere to go in this unfamiliar territory, the distant shape of a barn looming against the midnight sky was her only hope for shelter. The year was 1878, and the promise of a teaching position in Sweetwater had drawn her west from Boston. Now, as the temperature dropped and the wind howled across the open range, that promise seemed as distant as the warmth of the family home she had left behind. Her fingers had long since gone numb, and her lips had taken on a bluish tint that would have alarmed her if she had a mirror to see it. Samuel Xanders was checking his property one final time before turning in for the night. At 30 years old, he had spent the last decade building his modest cattle ranch from nothing, working the land with a determination born from having nothing to lose. The harsh winter had been taking its toll on his livestock, and he couldn't afford to lose any more to the freezing temperatures. As he approached the barn, lantern held high against the darkness, he noticed that the door was slightly ajar. He frowned. He was certain he had secured it earlier. Wolves had been prowling around lately, and the last thing he needed was for them to get to his horses or remaining cattle. Samuel pushed the door open cautiously, his free hand resting on the Colt revolver at his hip. The lantern light cast long shadows across the hay-strewn floor, illuminating a huddled figure in the corner. For a moment he thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice cutting through the silence. Josephine startled at the sound, pressing herself further into the corner, her eyes wide with fear. She had hoped to remain undiscovered until morning when she could continue her journey to town. "Please," she whispered, her voice trembling as much as her body. "I mean no harm." "I just needed shelter for the night." Samuel approached slowly, lifting his lantern higher to better see the intruder. What he found was a young woman, no older than 25, with chestnut hair falling in damp tangles around her pale face. Her clothing was woefully inadequate for the harsh Wyoming winter, and he could see her entire body convulsing with violent shivers. "Good Lord, miss," he breathed, immediately setting down his lantern. "You'll freeze to death out here." Without hesitation, Samuel shrugged off his heavy sheepskin coat and draped it around her shoulders. The warmth of it was immediate, and Josephine clutched at it gratefully, pulling it tighter around her. "Thank you," she managed between chattering teeth. "I didn't know what else to do." Samuel knelt beside her, concern evident in his weathered features. "How long have you been out in this cold?" "Hours," she admitted, her voice small. "The stagecoach left me." A flash of anger crossed his face. "Left you in this weather? That's as good as murder." He hesitated only briefly before making his decision. "My house isn't far. You need to get warm properly, miss." "Campbell," she supplied. "Josephine Campbell." "Samuel Xanders," he replied, tipping his hat slightly. "Can you walk, Miss Campbell?" She nodded, though uncertainty flickered in her eyes. When she tried to stand, her legs gave way beneath her, and Samuel caught her before she could fall. "Easy now," he murmured, his strong arms steadying her. "Let me help you." Without asking further permission, he lifted her into his arms, surprised at how little she weighed. Josephine was too exhausted and cold to protest the familiarity. She simply leaned into his chest, grateful for the human warmth after hours of isolation in the bitter cold. The walk to the main house seemed endless to Josephine, though it couldn't have been more than a few hundred yards. Samuel carried her with ease, his stride never faltering even as the wind picked up, sending swirls of snow dancing around them. The ranch house was modest but solid, built to withstand the harsh Wyoming elements. Samuel shouldered the door open and carried her directly to the fireplace, where embers still glowed from earlier in the evening. He set her down gently on a worn armchair before quickly adding logs to the fire and stoking it back to life. "Stay right there," he instructed, though there was little chance of her moving. "I'll heat some water and find you some dry clothes." Josephine nodded weakly, still wrapped in his coat, watching through half-lidded eyes as he moved efficiently around the cabin. There was something comforting about his presence, a steadiness that made her feel safe for the first time since leaving Boston. Samuel returned shortly with a steaming mug of coffee, sweetened with a precious spoonful of sugar. "Drink this," he said, pressing it into her trembling hands. "It'll warm you from the inside." She sipped gratefully, the hot liquid burning a path down her throat and into her stomach, spreading warmth throughout her body. As feeling returned to her extremities, so did pain, a burning sensation that made her wince. Samuel noticed her discomfort immediately. "Frostbite," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "Let me see your hands." Reluctantly, Josephine extended her hands, which were red and swollen. Samuel examined them gently, his calloused fingers surprisingly tender against her skin. "Not too severe," he said after a moment. "But we need to warm them properly. Your feet too, I expect." A flush crept into Josephine's cheeks at the impropriety of the situation, but Samuel's clinical approach put her somewhat at ease. He brought a basin of lukewarm water, not hot, he explained, as that could damage the frozen tissue, and helped her submerge her hands. "I have some of my sister's clothes here," he said, standing to retrieve them. "She visits occasionally from Cheyenne. They might be a bit large for you, but they're dry." Josephine was caught off guard. "Your sister?" Samuel nodded. "Sarah. She's married to a banker in Cheyenne, comes out to check on her lonely brother once in a while." A small smile played at the corners of his mouth, softening his otherwise serious demeanor. He handed her a simple cotton nightgown and a woolen robe. "You can change behind that screen," he said, indicating a wooden folding screen in the corner of the room. "I'll wait outside until you're decent." True to his word, Samuel excused himself, giving Josephine privacy to change out of her sodden clothes. The nightgown was indeed too large, but it was warm and dry, and after the ordeal she'd been through, it felt like the finest silk against her skin. "You can come back in," she called softly when she was finished. Samuel returned, carrying extra blankets. He spread them on the small sofa near the fire. "You take the bed," he said, nodding toward a door that presumably led to his bedroom. "I'll sleep out here." "I couldn't possibly take your bed," Josephine protested. "You've already been so kind." "Miss Campbell," Samuel said firmly, "you nearly froze to death tonight. You need proper rest, and that means a proper bed. I won't hear otherwise." There was a finality to his tone that brooked no argument, and Josephine found herself too exhausted to fight. She allowed him to lead her to the bedroom, which was sparsely furnished but clean and warm. "Thank you, Mr. Xanders," she said softly as she sat on the edge of the bed. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't found me." Something flickered in his eyes, concern perhaps, or something deeper. "Get some rest, Miss Campbell. We can talk more in the morning." As he turned to leave, she called out to him, "Mr. Xanders." He paused, looking back over his shoulder. "Your coat," she said, gesturing to where it still hung over the chair in the main room. "Won't you need it?" Samuel shook his head. "I have blankets. You keep it close, just in case." With that, he closed the door, leaving Josephine alone with her thoughts. Despite her exhaustion, sleep did not come immediately. Her mind raced with questions about what tomorrow would bring and gratitude for the stranger who had saved her life with nothing more than a coat and kindness. When morning came, Josephine woke to the smell of coffee and bacon. For a moment, she couldn't remember where she was, but then the events of the previous night came flooding back. She rose carefully, finding her body stiff and sore but significantly warmer than before. She found Samuel in the kitchen, standing over a cast-iron stove. He turned when he heard her approach, and a small smile crossed his face. "Good morning, Miss Campbell. I trust you slept well." "Better than I expected, thank you," she replied, self-consciously tugging at the too large nightgown. "I hope I haven't caused you too much inconvenience." Samuel waved away her concern. "No inconvenience at all. I rarely have company out here, so it's nice to have someone to cook for besides myself." He gestured for her to sit at the small wooden table, which he had already set with 2 mismatched plates and cups. "Your color looks better today," he observed as he served her a plate of eggs and bacon. "How do you feel?" "Much improved, thanks to your kindness," Josephine said sincerely. She hesitated before adding, "I should explain why I was in your barn last night." Samuel sat across from her, his own plate before him. "I figured you'd tell me when you were ready." Over breakfast, Josephine shared her story how she had come west to take a teaching position in Sweetwater, how the stagecoach driver had made unwanted advances, and how she had found herself abandoned at her remote stop when she rejected him. "I had no money for lodging," she explained, "and when I tried to explain my situation to the station master, She trailed off, uncomfortable with the memory. "He wasn't sympathetic," Samuel finished for her, his jaw tight with anger. "So you walked in the dead of winter with no proper clothing or supplies." "I didn't see that I had much choice," Josephine said simply. "I needed to reach Sweetwater by tomorrow today now, I suppose, or they'll give the position to someone else." Samuel frowned. "Sweetwater's still a good 20 miles from here. You'd never make it on foot, especially not in this weather." Josephine's heart sank. After everything she had endured to get this far, to fail now seemed unbearable. "Perhaps there's a stagecoach I could take." "I have a little money sewn into my dress." Samuel shook his head. "No stage comes near here. The nearest stop is back the way you came, and that's 10 miles at least." He paused, considering. "I could take you." Josephine looked up in surprise. "Take me, but you've already done so much." "I need to go to town for supplies anyway," he said, though Josephine suspected this wasn't entirely true. "It's no trouble to continue on to Sweetwater afterward." "I couldn't ask that of you," she protested weakly, even as relief flooded through her. "You're not asking," Samuel pointed out with a slight smile. "I'm offering. Besides, I can't in good conscience let you attempt the journey alone, not after finding you half frozen in my barn." There was something in his steady gaze that made Josephine trust him implicitly. She nodded slowly. "Thank you, Mr. Xanders. I don't know how I'll ever repay your kindness." "No need for repayment," he assured her. "Though I will ask that you call me Samuel. Mr. Xanders makes me feel like my father." A small smile tugged at Josephine's lips. "Then you must call me Josephine." Samuel nodded, returning her smile with one of his own. "Josephine it is. Now we should get ready if we're going to reach Sweetwater by nightfall. The roads will be difficult after last night's snow." While Samuel prepared the wagon and horses, Josephine changed back into her own dress, which he had thoughtfully hung near the fire to dry overnight. It was still somewhat damp in places, but it was far better than it had been. Over it, she wore a woolen shawl that Samuel insisted had belonged to his sister and that she wouldn't miss. The journey to Sweetwater would take most of the day, Samuel explained as he helped her into the wagon. He had packed provisions, bread, cheese, and a flask of coffee and plenty of blankets to keep them warm. As they set off, the morning sun glinted off the fresh snow, turning the landscape into a dazzling expanse of white. Despite the cold, there was a beauty to the Wyoming wilderness that took Josephine's breath away. "It's beautiful," she murmured, gazing out at the snow-covered plains stretching to the distant mountains. Samuel glanced at her, a look of pride crossing his features. "This is why I stayed." Most folks pass through, heading for California or Oregon, but there's something about this land that gets under your skin. "How long have you been here?" Josephine asked, genuinely curious about the quiet cowboy who had saved her life. 10 years now," Samuel replied, guiding the horses carefully along the snow-covered trail. "Came out after the war with nothing but the clothes on my back and a determination to build something of my own." "The war," Josephine echoed. "You fought in the Civil War." Samuel nodded, his expression growing distant. "Enlisted when I was 18. Spent 3 years fighting for the Union, saw things no man should ever have to see." He paused, as if deciding how much to share. "When it was over, I couldn't go back to Pennsylvania." Everything had changed, or maybe I had. Josephine watched his profile as he spoke, noticing the way the sun highlighted the flecks of gold in his brown hair and the slight crease between his brows that deepened when he talked about the past. "So you came west," she prompted gently when he fell silent. "So I came west," he agreed. "Worked as a ranch hand for a few years, saved every penny. When the Homestead Act opened up this territory, I staked my claim, been building it up ever since. Alone." The question slipped out before Josephine could stop it, and she immediately felt intrusive. I apologize, that was forward of me, but Samuel didn't seem offended. Mostly alone, he admitted. Had a partner for a while, but he moved on to California a few years back. Now it's just me and the cattle, he glanced at her. What about you? What brings a Boston schoolteacher all the way to Wyoming territory? Josephine hesitated, wondering how much of her own story to share. There was something about Samuel's straightforward manner that invited confidence, however. My father died last spring, she began, her fingers twisting in the fabric of her dress. He left considerable debts, and our home was sold to pay them. My mother went to live with my married sister in New York, but there was no place for me there. So you decided to go west, Samuel finished for her. I saw an advertisement for teachers in the Western Territories, she explained. The pay is better than in the East, and they provide housing. It seemed like an opportunity to start fresh, to build something of my own, not unlike your reasons, I suppose. Samuel nodded, a newfound respect in his eyes. It takes courage to leave everything familiar behind. Or desperation, Josephine said with a small, self-deprecating smile. But I prefer your interpretation. They continued talking as the wagon made its way along the snowy trail. Josephine found Samuel easy to talk to, despite his initially taciturn appearance. He had a quiet intelligence and a dry wit that occasionally surprised a laugh from her. By midday, they stopped to rest the horses and eat the provisions Samuel had packed. He spread a blanket over a fallen log, clearing it of snow so Josephine would have somewhere to sit. Tell me about Sweetwater, she requested as they shared the bread and cheese. What sort of place is it? Growing, Samuel replied after a thoughtful pause. It started as a mining town about 15 years ago, but the mines played out. Now it's mostly ranchers and farmers. They built a proper school last year, that's probably why they're looking for teachers. And the people. Samuel considered this. Like anywhere, I suppose, some good, some not so good. The mayor, Jenkins, is a decent sort. There's a Dr. Harmon who knows his business. A few saloons, a general store, a church. It sounds civilized, Josephine said, trying to hide her relief. After her experience with the stagecoach driver, she had worried about what kind of place she was heading to. Civilized enough, Samuel agreed with a slight smile. They even have literary society meetings once a month, I hear. Josephine's eyes brightened at this. Really? I wouldn't have expected that. Folks out here are hungry for culture, Samuel explained. Most had it where they came from and miss it. The isolation is the hardest part of frontier life. There was something in his tone that made Josephine wonder if he was speaking from personal experience. Before she could ask, however, he stood, brushing crumbs from his trousers. We should get moving if we want to reach Sweetwater before dark, he said, offering his hand to help her up. Their fingers touched, and Josephine felt a strange flutter in her chest. She attributed it to the cold, or perhaps lingering weakness from her near-freezing experience. Surely it had nothing to do with the way Samuel's eyes crinkled slightly at the corners when he smiled, or the gentle strength in his calloused hands. The afternoon brought darker skies and a drop in temperature. Samuel frowned up at the gathering clouds. Looks like another storm coming, he muttered, urging the horses to a faster pace. Will we make it to Sweetwater before it hits? Josephine asked, pulling her borrowed shawl tighter around her shoulders. We'll try, was all Samuel would commit to. He reached behind the seat and pulled out his heavy sheepskin coat, the same one he had draped around her in the barn the night before. Here, put this on. The temperature's dropping fast. But what about you? She protested, even as she accepted the coat gratefully. I'm used to it, he said simply, though she noticed him suppressing a shiver, and I'm not the one who nearly froze to death last night. Josephine wanted to argue but couldn't deny the logic of his words. She slipped the coat on, immediately enveloped in its warmth and the faint scent of leather, horses, and something uniquely Samuel. The first snowflakes began to fall an hour later, gentle at first but quickly becoming more insistent. Samuel's expression grew increasingly grim as visibility deteriorated. How much further? Josephine asked, trying to keep the worry from her voice. Too far in this weather, Samuel admitted. There's a line shack about 2 miles ahead, belongs to the Circle T Ranch. We might need to stop there until this blows over." The snow was falling in earnest now, the wind driving it horizontally across the trail. Samuel hunched forward, his hat pulled low over his eyes as he strained to see the path ahead. Josephine sat as close to him as propriety allowed, trying to share some of the warmth from his coat. When the small cabin finally came into view, it was little more than a dark shape against the white landscape. Samuel let out an audible sigh of relief. "Thank God," he murmured, guiding the horses toward it. "I was beginning to think I'd missed it in the storm." The line shack was primitive but solid, a single room with a stone fireplace, a narrow cot along one wall, a rough table with 2 chairs, and a few basic supplies stored in a cupboard. Samuel quickly settled the horses in the attached lean-to before joining Josephine inside. "It's not much," he said apologetically as he shook snow from his hat and shoulders, "but it's shelter." "It's perfect," Josephine assured him, already kneeling by the fireplace to arrange kindling from the woodbox. Her years in Boston might have been comfortable, but her father had believed in practical education. Building a fire was a skill she possessed. Samuel watched her with undisguised appreciation as she coaxed the flames to life. "You're full of surprises, Miss Campbell." "Josephine," she reminded him with a small smile, "and necessity is an excellent teacher. My father was often indisposed in his later years. Someone had to keep the house warm." There was a story there, Samuel sensed, but he didn't pry. Instead, he set about taking stock of the cabin's provisions. "We have beans, coffee, and some salt pork. Not exactly a feast, but it'll keep us going." "It sounds wonderful," Josephine said sincerely, her stomach reminding her that it had been hours since their midday meal. As Samuel prepared their simple dinner, Josephine found herself studying him surreptitiously. He moved with an economy of motion, nothing wasted or hurried. His hands, though weathered and calloused from years of hard work, handled the tin plates and cups with surprising gentleness. "You're staring," he said without looking up, a hint of amusement in his voice. Josephine flushed, caught off guard. "I was just wondering about you," she admitted. "You seem different from the other Western men I've encountered." Samuel glanced at her, one eyebrow raised. "Different good or different bad, different good," she assured him. "You're kind, thoughtful. You gave your coat to a stranger shivering in your barn without hesitation." He shrugged, seeming uncomfortable with the praise. Anyone would have done the same. "No," Josephine said with quiet certainty. "Not anyone. The stagecoach driver left me to die rather than face rejection. The station master turned me away when I had nowhere to go." Samuel's jaw tightened at the reminder, but he said nothing as he handed her a plate of beans and salt pork. They ate in companionable silence, the fire crackling and the wind howling outside the sturdy walls of the line shack. After dinner, Samuel insisted Josephine take the cot while he would sleep on the floor near the fire. She protested. It seemed she was always taking his bed, but he was adamant. "I've slept in worse places," he assured her. "During the war, a patch of dry ground was luxury. This is positively decadent by comparison." Josephine wasn't convinced, but she was too tired to argue further. The events of the past 2 days had taken their toll, and the warmth of the fire and the full meal were making her eyelids heavy. She lay on the narrow cot, watching as Samuel spread his bedroll on the floor. In the flickering firelight, his profile was strong and defined, his movements sure and steady. There was something comforting about his presence, a sense of safety she hadn't felt since before her father's death. "Samuel," she called softly as he settled onto his makeshift bed. He turned to look at her, his expression questioning. "Thank you," she said simply. "Not just for the coat last night, but for everything. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't come along." Samuel held her gaze for a long moment, something unreadable in his eyes. "Get some rest, Josephine," he said finally, his voice soft. "Tomorrow we'll get you to Sweetwater." Josephine nodded, pulling the rough blanket up to her chin. As she drifted off to sleep, she found herself wondering what would happen after they reached Sweetwater. Would Samuel simply drop her off and return to his ranch? The thought left her with an unexpected pang of loss. She dreamed of snow and darkness, of walking endlessly through a white wilderness with no shelter in sight. In her dream, she was calling a name, Samuel's name, but he couldn't hear her, couldn't find her in the blinding snow. Josephine woke with a start, her heart racing. The fire had burned down to embers, casting the cabin in shadows. For a moment she was disoriented, unsure where she was or what had woken her. Then she heard it, Samuel's voice, low and distressed. He was still asleep, but he was clearly in the grip of a nightmare, his body tense and his breathing ragged. Without thinking, Josephine slipped from the cot and knelt beside him. "Samuel," she called softly, hesitating before placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Samuel, wake up, you're dreaming." He came awake abruptly, his hand shooting out to grasp her wrist. For a heartbeat, there was no recognition in his eyes, only fear and a soldier's instinct. "It's me," she said calmly, though her heart was racing. "It's Josephine, you're safe." The confusion cleared from his eyes, replaced by embarrassment as he released her wrist. "Josephine," he breathed, sitting up. "I'm sorry, did I wake you?" "You were having a nightmare," she said, settling beside him on the floor. "The war," Samuel nodded, running a hand through his tousled hair. "It happens sometimes, less often than it used to, but some memories don't fade as easily as others." Josephine's heart ached for him. How many nights had he woken alone in his ranch house, haunted by visions of battles long past? "Do you want to talk about it?" she offered. He was silent for so long that she thought he wouldn't answer. Finally he spoke, his voice low and measured. "It was Gettysburg. The third day, I was with the 20th Maine on Little Round Top." Josephine had read about the battle in the newspapers, but hearing about it from someone who had lived through it was entirely different. "We held the far left of the Union line," Samuel continued, his gaze fixed on the dying embers. "If we had broken, the entire army of the Potomac might have been flanked and destroyed, so we fought, and when we ran out of ammunition, we fixed bayonets and charged downhill." He fell silent again, lost in memory. Josephine didn't press him, simply sat beside him, a silent witness to his pain. "I killed men that day," he said finally. "Men who were just like me, except they wore gray instead of blue. I looked into their eyes as they died on my bayonet." His voice cracked slightly. "That's what I dream about, their eyes." Without thinking, Josephine reached out and took his hand. His fingers were cold and she wrapped both of her hands around them. "You did what you had to do," she said softly. "You followed orders, you survived." "Yes," he agreed, his voice hollow. "I survived. Sometimes I wonder why." "To build your ranch," Josephine suggested. "To make something good and lasting after so much destruction. To find a shivering woman in your barn and save her life with nothing more than a coat and kindness." That drew a small smile from him, and he turned to look at her properly. In the dim light from the embers, her face was soft and open, without judgment or fear. Samuel was struck by how beautiful she was, not just in appearance, but in spirit. "You have a way of seeing the best in things, Josephine Campbell," he said, his voice warm with something more than gratitude. "Not always," she admitted, "but I'm trying to. It's easier when there's something good to see." Their eyes held for a long moment, and Josephine became acutely aware that they were sitting very close, that she was still holding his hand, that they were alone in a small cabin in the middle of nowhere. A proper Boston lady would be scandalized at the situation. Strangely, Josephine couldn't bring herself to care. The moment was broken by a log shifting in the fireplace, sending up a shower of sparks. Samuel cleared his throat and gently withdrew his hand. "We should try to get some more sleep," he said, though there was a reluctance in his tone. "The storm might clear by morning, and we'll still have a long ride to Sweetwater." Josephine nodded and rose, though she was strangely reluctant to return to the cot. "Good night, Samuel," she said softly. "Good night, Josephine," he replied, watching as she made her way back to the cot. Sleep was a long time coming for both of them after that, their thoughts too full of each other and the strange, unexpected connection that had formed between them in just 2 short days. Morning brought clear skies and a transformed landscape. The storm had dumped nearly a foot of fresh snow overnight, turning the world into a dazzling white expanse under the bright January sun. Samuel was already up when Josephine woke, rekindling the fire and heating coffee. He turned at the sound of her stirring, and his smile sent a warm flutter through her chest. "Good morning," he greeted her. "Coffee's almost ready." It smells wonderful, she said, sitting up and smoothing her tangled hair self-consciously. She must look a fright after 2 days without a proper toilet, but Samuel didn't seem to notice or care. They breakfasted on the last of the provisions, coffee and hardtack from the cabin's supplies before Samuel went to check on the horses and prepare for their departure. "The snow's deep," he reported when he returned, stomping his boots to clear them of snow. "But the sky's clear and the horses are rested. We should be able to make Sweetwater by afternoon." Josephine nodded, trying to ignore the pang of disappointment at the thought that their journey was nearly over. Soon she would be in Sweetwater, starting her new life as a schoolteacher, and Samuel would return to his ranch. They would go their separate ways, likely never to meet again. The thought was more painful than it should have been, given that they had known each other for less than 2 days. The journey to Sweetwater was slower than expected, the wagon having to break through fresh snow. Samuel kept up a steady stream of conversation, pointing out landmarks and sharing stories of his early days in the territory. Josephine found herself laughing more than she had in months, drawn out of her usual reserve by his quiet humor and unassuming manner. As they crested a hill in the early afternoon, Sweetwater came into view, a collection of wooden buildings sprawled along a main street, smoke rising from chimneys against the blue winter sky. "There it is," Samuel said, gesturing with his chin. "Your new home." Josephine studied the town with mixed emotions. It was larger than she had expected, with at least a dozen substantial buildings and numerous smaller structures spreading outward. The promised school was visible at the far end of the main street, a 2-story wooden building with a small bell tower. "It's lovely," she said, hoping her voice didn't betray her sudden uncertainty. Samuel glanced at her, reading her expression with unexpected perceptiveness. "Having second thoughts, not exactly," she hedged, "just wondering what awaits me there." "A new beginning," Samuel reminded her gently. "Isn't that what you wanted?" "Yes," Josephine agreed, forcing a smile. "Yes, of course it is." They made their way down the hill and into town, drawing curious glances from the few people braving the cold afternoon. Samuel guided the wagon directly to the school, where he helped Josephine down before securing the horses. "The schoolmaster's residence should be around back," he explained, picking up her small carpet bag, the only possession she had managed to keep with her when the stagecoach left her behind. Sure enough, a small but tidy cottage stood behind the school building. A thin wisp of smoke rose from its chimney, suggesting that someone was expecting them, or at least expecting Josephine. Samuel knocked on the door, and after a moment, it was opened by an elderly woman with silver hair pulled into a severe bun and sharp, assessing eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. "Yes?" she inquired, her gaze moving from Samuel to Josephine with obvious curiosity. "Mrs. Holloway." Josephine stepped forward. "I'm Josephine Campbell, the new teacher from Boston. I believe you're expecting me." The woman's eyebrows rose in surprise. "Miss Campbell, we had given you up for lost. The stagecoach arrived without you 2 days ago, and the driver claimed you had decided to stay in Laramie." Josephine's eyes narrowed at this blatant lie. "I assure you that was not the case. The driver abandoned me at a way station after I declined his advances. Mrs. Holloway's expression shifted from surprise to outrage. "The scoundrel, well, thank goodness you made it safely, but how did you get here?" Her gaze returned to Samuel, who stood slightly behind Josephine, hat in hand. "This is Mr. Xanders," Josephine explained, stepping aside to include him properly. "He found me seeking shelter in his barn during the storm and was kind enough to bring me to Sweetwater." "Samuel Xanders." Mrs. Holloway peered at him more closely. "The rancher from north of here." Samuel nodded, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. "Yes, madam." "Well, Mr. Xanders, it seems Sweetwater owes you a debt of gratitude," Mrs. Holloway declared. "Our children have been without a proper teacher since Miss Jenkins married last fall. Miss Campbell comes highly recommended." "She's very capable," Samuel agreed, his eyes meeting Josephine's briefly. There was warmth in his gaze that made her cheeks flush. "Well, don't just stand there in the cold," Mrs. Holloway said briskly, stepping back to gesture them inside. "Come in, both of you." I've kept the fire going in anticipation of Miss Campbell's arrival, though I admit I had nearly given up hope. The cottage was small but comfortable, with a combined kitchen and sitting area, a tiny bedroom visible through a partially open door, and a surprising number of bookshelves filled with volumes. The school board provides housing as part of your compensation, Mrs. Holloway explained to Josephine as she busied herself preparing tea. It's modest, but it's yours for as long as you hold the position. It's lovely, Josephine said sincerely, running her fingers over the spines of the books, a mix of classics, history texts, and primers for teaching various subjects. Samuel stood awkwardly by the door, clearly feeling out of place in the domestic setting. I should be going, he said, placing Josephine's carpet bag on a chair. You're in good hands now. Josephine turned quickly, a protest rising to her lips before she could stop it. Must you leave so soon? Mrs. Holloway looked between them with shrewd eyes. Mr. Xanders, you must at least stay for tea, and given the hour, you should consider staying in town tonight. The Willoughby Hotel has clean rooms at reasonable rates. I wouldn't want to impose, Samuel began, but Mrs. Holloway cut him off with a wave of her hand. Nonsense. After what you did for Miss Campbell, the least we can do is offer you a proper meal and a warm bed before you return to your ranch. In fact, I insist you join us for dinner at my home this evening. My husband is the mayor, and he'll want to thank you personally. Samuel looked to Josephine, who tried to conceal her hope that he would accept. Please stay, she said softly, at least for tonight. Something in her expression must have decided him. All right, he agreed with a small nod. Thank you for your hospitality, Mrs. Holloway. The older woman beamed. Excellent. Now sit down, both of you, while I finish this tea. Then I'll show Miss Campbell around the school while you get settled at the hotel, Mr. Xanders. Dinner will be at 6 o'clock sharp. As Mrs. Holloway bustled about the small kitchen, Samuel and Josephine shared a glance, a small smile passing between them. One more evening, Josephine thought. One more chance to explore the strange, unexpected connection that had formed between them in the midst of a Wyoming winter. The school was larger than it appeared from the outside, with 2 large classrooms downstairs and a library and office upstairs. Mrs. Holloway, who Josephine learned had been serving as a temporary teacher until her replacement arrived, showed her around with obvious pride. We have 47 students enrolled, ages 6 to 16, she explained as they toured the empty classrooms. The younger children attend in the morning, the older ones in the afternoon. It allows the older children to help with farm and ranch work during the mornings. Josephine nodded, taking in the rows of desks, the large slate boards, and the maps hanging on the walls. It was far better equipped than she had expected for a frontier town. The town has grown considerably in the past few years, Mrs. Holloway continued, as if reading her thoughts. Many of our families came from the East, bringing their expectations for education with them. My husband has been very supportive of developing a proper school. It's impressive, Josephine said sincerely. In Boston, I taught at a small ladies' academy with fewer resources than this. Mrs. Holloway beamed with pride. Sweetwater may be on the frontier, but we believe in the value of education. Now, classes will begin on Monday, which gives you 3 days to settle in and prepare. Is there anything you need that isn't provided? Josephine thought of her lost trunk, which contained most of her clothing and personal possessions. Unfortunately, most of my belongings were on the Stagecoach. I have only what I'm wearing and what's in my carpet bag. Oh dear, Mrs. Holloway frowned. Well, that won't do at all. I'll speak to my husband about sending someone to retrieve your trunk from Laramie. In the meantime, I'm sure we can find you some suitable clothing. Several of the ladies in town are about your size. By the time they returned to the cottage, Josephine's head was spinning with information and names of people she would soon meet. Mrs. Holloway's efficiency was impressive, if somewhat overwhelming. Now, about dinner tonight, the older woman said as they stepped back into the cottage. I've invited a few key members of the community to meet you, the doctor and his wife, the Reverend, and Mr. Patterson, who owns the general store. Oh, and Mr. Xanders, of course. Josephine nodded, trying not to reveal that the only name that truly interested her was the last one. That sounds lovely, though I'm afraid I'm not dressed for a formal dinner. I've thought of that, Mrs. Holloway said with a satisfied smile. My niece left some dresses when she visited last summer. She's about your height, though perhaps a bit fuller in figure. I've taken the liberty of having one sent over. It should be here shortly. True to her word, a package arrived within the hour, containing a modest but attractive blue dress that, with some minor adjustments, fit Josephine quite well. There was also a brush, hairpins, and even a small pot of face powder luxuries Josephine hadn't expected to find in a frontier town. After a brief rest, during which Josephine found herself thinking more about Samuel than about her new position, she prepared for the dinner. She arranged her hair as best she could and put on the borrowed dress, which was of a slightly older style but still quite presentable. Mrs. Holloway sent her grandson to escort Josephine to the mayor's house at 5:45. The boy, a solemn 10-year-old named Thomas, regarded his future teacher with undisguised curiosity as they walked the short distance through town. "Grandma says you're from Boston," he said as they navigated the snowy boardwalks. "Is it true they have buildings as tall as 3 stories there?" Josephine smiled at his wonder. Even taller in some cases, there are buildings in Boston that are 5 or 6 stories high. Thomas's eyes widened. "Gosh, I can't imagine such a thing. The hotel here is the tallest building in Sweetwater and it's only 3 stories. "Sweetwater is growing," Josephine pointed out. "Perhaps someday it will have tall buildings too." The mayor's house was the largest private residence Josephine had seen in town, a 2-story clapboard structure with gingerbread trim and actual glass windows, a luxury in a place where most buildings made do with oilcloth or shutters. Thomas led her to the front door and knocked importantly. A maid in a neat black dress and white apron answered, ushering Josephine into a well-appointed parlor where several people were already gathered. Samuel was there, standing somewhat awkwardly by the fireplace. He had cleaned up since their arrival in town, his hair neatly combed and his usual work clothes replaced by a clean white shirt and dark trousers. When he saw Josephine, his expression softened into a warm smile that made her heart skip. "Miss Campbell." Mayor Holloway, a corpulent man with a jovial manner, approached with his hand extended. "Welcome to Sweetwater. My wife has told me all about your harrowing journey. Simply dreadful what happened with that stagecoach driver. I've already dispatched a letter of complaint to the company." "Thank you, Mayor Holloway," Josephine said, shaking his offered hand. "And thank you for the teaching position. I'm looking forward to beginning on Monday." "Splendid, splendid," the mayor beamed. "Now let me introduce you to everyone." The next few minutes were a blur of names and faces as Josephine was presented to the town's leading citizens. Dr. Harmon and his wife were a pleasant middle-aged couple who had come west from Philadelphia 10 years earlier. Reverend Thomas was a stern-looking man with kind eyes who assured Josephine that most of her students attended Sunday school regularly and were well-versed in Scripture. Mr. Patterson, the general store owner, was a shrewd-looking man with a ready smile who immediately offered to extend credit to Josephine until her first month's salary was paid. Through it all, Josephine was acutely aware of Samuel watching her from across the room. When the introductions were finally complete and they were called to dinner, he managed to position himself beside her at the large dining table. "You look lovely," he murmured as he held her chair. "Blue suits you." Josephine felt a blush creeping into her cheeks. "Thank you." "You clean up quite nicely yourself, Mr. Xanders." His lips quirked in a half-smile. "I do own more than one shirt, contrary to what you might have thought." The dinner was elaborate by frontier standards: roast beef, potatoes, carrots, fresh bread, and even a berry pie for dessert. The conversation flowed easily, with most of the questions directed at Josephine about her background and qualifications, though Samuel received his share of attention as well. "Mr. Xanders rarely comes to town," Mrs. Patterson noted with a meaningful glance between Samuel and Josephine. "We're delighted he could join us tonight. Just happened to be passing through with Miss Campbell," Samuel said mildly, though Josephine noticed a slight tightening around his eyes. Well, we're grateful for your assistance, Mayor Holloway declared, raising his glass. To Mr. Xanders, whose timely intervention saved our new schoolteacher from a most unfortunate fate. Everyone raised their glasses in a toast, and Samuel nodded in acknowledgement, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. Under the table, Josephine impulsively placed her hand on his, a brief gesture of support that no one else could see. He glanced at her in surprise, then gave her fingers a gentle squeeze before they both withdrew their hands. After dinner, the men retired to the mayor's study for cigars, while the women gathered in the parlor for coffee. Josephine found herself seated beside Mrs. Harmon, who proved to be a fount of information about Sweetwater and its inhabitants. "You must join our literary society," the doctor's wife insisted. "We meet every third Tuesday. Currently, we're reading Middlemarch. Are you familiar with it?" "I am," Josephine confirmed. "I admire George Eliot's work greatly." "Wonderful," Mrs. Harmon beamed. "We have so few new additions to our circle. Most of the women who come west are more concerned with practical matters than literature." Across the room, Mrs. Holloway and Mrs. Patterson were engaged in a hushed conversation, occasionally glancing in Josephine's direction. She tried not to notice, focusing instead on Mrs. Harmon's enthusiastic description of the spring social calendar. When the men rejoined them a half-hour later, Josephine immediately sought out Samuel. He looked slightly more relaxed than before, though still not entirely comfortable in the formal setting. "Surviving?" she asked quietly as he took a seat beside her on a small settee. "Barely," he admitted with a rueful smile. "I've spent more time in polite society tonight than in the past year combined." "You hide it well," she assured him, "though I suspect you'll be glad to return to your ranch tomorrow." Something flickered in his eyes, regret, perhaps. "It has its advantages," he said after a moment. "Peace, quiet. No one expecting me to have an opinion on the territorial governor's latest proclamation." Josephine laughed softly. "I can see how that would be appealing." She hesitated, then added, "Will you come to town often? For supplies, perhaps?" Samuel studied her face, seeming to search for something in her expression. "I typically come in once a month, more often in good weather." "I see," Josephine said, trying not to reveal her disappointment at how infrequent his visits would be. "Well, I'm sure the school would welcome you if you ever wished to speak to the children about ranching, educational experiences, and all that." A slow smile spread across Samuel's face. "Is that an invitation, Miss Campbell?" "A professional courtesy," she corrected primly, though her eyes sparkled with something more personal. "Though I would certainly enjoy seeing a familiar face while I adjust to my new surroundings." Before Samuel could respond, Mayor Holloway approached, effectively ending their private conversation. The remainder of the evening passed in general discussion, with Josephine occasionally catching Samuel's eye across the room, a small smile passing between them each time. As the gathering drew to a close, Samuel offered to walk Josephine back to her cottage. The night was clear and cold, the stars brilliant overhead and the fresh snow crunching beneath their boots as they made their way through the quiet town. "Did you enjoy the dinner?" Josephine asked, breaking the comfortable silence between them. "It was illuminating," Samuel replied thoughtfully. "The Holloways clearly think highly of you. Mrs. Patterson was already planning which eligible bachelors to introduce you to." Josephine nearly missed a step. "Was she?" "How mortifying," Samuel chuckled. "Don't worry, I think Mayor Holloway's nephew is currently at the top of her list. He's due to visit from Denver next month. Apparently, he's a lawyer with political ambitions." "How thrilling," Josephine said dryly. "I shall contain my excitement until then." They reached the cottage, pausing at the small gate that led to the front door. In the moonlight, Samuel's face was half in shadow, but Josephine could see the conflict in his expression. "Will I see you before you leave tomorrow?" she asked, not wanting to say goodbye just yet. "I thought I might stop by in the morning," he said, "to make sure you're settling in all right, if that wouldn't be an imposition." "Not at all," Josephine assured him quickly. "I would like that very much." Samuel nodded, his eyes never leaving her face. "Josephine," he began, then stopped, seeming to struggle with what he wanted to say. "Yes," she prompted gently. He shook his head slightly. Nothing, it's late and you must be tired after everything you've been through. I'll see you in the morning. Josephine tried not to let her disappointment show. Good night, Samuel, and thank you again for everything. Good night, Josephine, he replied softly. She turned to go, then paused, struck by a sudden impulse. Before she could think better of it, she turned back and rose on her tiptoes to press a quick kiss to his cheek. For saving my life, she whispered, then hurried inside before he could respond. Josephine leaned against the closed door, her heart racing and her cheeks burning. What had possessed her to be so forward? Samuel would think her shameless, no better than the girls who worked in the saloons. Outside, Samuel stood frozen, one hand raised to touch the spot where her lips had brushed his skin. A slow smile spread across his face, and he turned away, walking toward the hotel with a lighter step than before. Morning came with bright sunshine and the sounds of a town coming to life. Josephine had slept better than expected in her new home, though her dreams had been filled with images of Samuel, his smile, his eyes, the way he had looked at her in the moonlight. She had just finished dressing in one of the garments Mrs. Holloway had provided a simple calico day dress that fit reasonably well when there was a knock at the door. Her heart quickened, knowing who it must be. Samuel stood on her doorstep, hat in hand, looking somewhat uncertain. "Good morning," he greeted her. "I hope I'm not calling too early." "Not at all," Josephine assured him, stepping back to invite him in. "I was just about to make coffee. Would you like some?" "Thank you," he said, entering the cottage and glancing around in the daylight. "You're getting settled then?" "As much as possible without my belongings," she replied, moving to the small stove to put the coffee pot on. "Mrs. Holloway has been very helpful. She's arranged for someone to retrieve my trunk from Laramie, and several ladies in town have offered to lend me clothing until it arrives." Samuel nodded, still standing somewhat awkwardly in the middle of the room. "The people here are good folks for the most part. They take care of their own." "And am I one of their own now?" Josephine asked, glancing at him over her shoulder. "You will be," he said with certainty. "They need a good teacher, and they already seem to like you." There was a moment of silence as Josephine busied herself with the coffee. When it was ready, she poured 2 cups and joined Samuel at the small table by the window. "When will you leave?" she asked, cradling her cup in both hands. "Soon," he replied, his eyes meeting hers. "I need to get back to the ranch. There's always work to be done, especially in winter." Josephine nodded, trying to hide her disappointment. "Of course, I understand." Samuel took a sip of his coffee, then set the cup down carefully. "Josephine," he began, his voice serious, "I've been thinking about what happens next." Her heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" "I mean," he said slowly, "that I find myself reluctant to say goodbye to you, which is unexpected given that we've known each other for only 3 days. Josephine's hands tightened around her cup. "I feel the same way," she admitted softly. "It's strange, isn't it, to feel such a connection with someone in so short a time?" "Very strange," Samuel agreed, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "And yet here we are." "Here we are," she echoed, returning his smile. Samuel leaned forward slightly. "I'd like to call on you properly, if you would permit it. When I come to town for supplies, perhaps we could have dinner, or you could visit the ranch sometime when the weather improves." Josephine felt a rush of warmth that had nothing to do with the coffee. "I would like that very much," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Good," Samuel nodded, seeming relieved. "That's good." They finished their coffee in companionable silence, both aware that something significant had shifted between them. When it was time for Samuel to leave, they walked together to where he had left his wagon at the hotel stables. "You'll be all right here?" he asked as he prepared to depart. "You have everything you need. I'll be fine," Josephine assured him. "I'm looking forward to starting classes on Monday and to your next visit to town." Samuel hesitated, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. "I wrote down directions to the ranch," he said, handing it to her. "Just in case you ever need to find it again, under better circumstances than last time, preferably." Josephine took the paper, their fingers brushing. "Thank you, though I hope I won't need to seek shelter in your barn again." "The house is always open to you," he said simply. Then, with a glance around to ensure they weren't observed, he leaned down and pressed a gentle kiss to her cheek. Until next time, Josephine Campbell. Before she could respond, he climbed into the wagon and took up the reins. With a tip of his hat and a final smile, he was off, the wagon rolling down Sweetwater's Main Street and eventually disappearing from view. Josephine stood watching long after he was gone, the piece of paper clutched in her hand and the memory of his lips on her cheek burning like a promise. The first month in Sweetwater passed in a blur of activity. Josephine threw herself into teaching with enthusiasm, quickly earning the respect of both her students and their parents. Her trunk eventually arrived from Laramie, allowing her to reclaim her own clothing and the few personal possessions she had brought from Boston. She settled into the rhythm of frontier life more easily than she had expected. The hardships were real water had to be carried from the town pump, heat came from wood she chopped herself, and conveniences she had taken for granted in Boston were non-existent here. But there was also a freedom and purpose to her new life that she found deeply satisfying. True to his word, Samuel appeared in town exactly 1 month after their parting. Josephine was in the middle of afternoon lessons when she glanced out the window and saw his wagon stopped in front of the general store. Her heart leapt, and she very nearly lost her place in the reading she was conducting. Miss Campbell, one of her older students, Emily Patterson, gave her a knowing look. "Is everything all right?" "Perfectly fine, Emily," Josephine replied, forcing her attention back to the lesson. "Now, where were we?" "Ah, yes, the Treaty of Paris. Who can tell me what year it was signed?" The remainder of the afternoon was an exercise in patience. When the final bell rang and the students filed out, Josephine resisted the urge to rush through her end-of-day tasks. She carefully erased the slate boards, straightened the desks, and recorded the day's attendance in her ledger before finally allowing herself to leave. She was locking the school door when she heard his voice behind her. "Good afternoon, Miss Campbell." Josephine turned to find Samuel standing at the bottom of the steps, hat in hand and a small smile on his face. He looked exactly as she remembered, though perhaps a bit more tanned from working outdoors. "Mr. Xanders," she greeted him, trying to keep her voice steady despite the way her pulse had quickened. "What a pleasant surprise." "Is it?" he asked, his smile widening slightly. "I believe I mentioned I come to town monthly for supplies." "So you did," Josephine acknowledged, descending the steps to stand before him. "And have you completed your business in town?" "Almost," Samuel replied. "I still need to call on the school teacher, as promised. I was hoping she might join me for dinner at the hotel restaurant." Josephine pretended to consider this. "Well, I suppose she might be persuaded if the invitation is sincere." "Very sincere," Samuel assured her, his eyes warm as they met hers. "In that case," Josephine said with a small smile, "I accept, though I should change first if you don't mind waiting." "I don't mind at all," Samuel said, offering his arm. "May I walk you home?" The walk to her cottage was brief, but filled with quiet conversation as Josephine told him about her first month of teaching, and Samuel updated her on developments at his ranch. It was easy, comfortable, as if they had known each other for years rather than weeks. Dinner at the hotel restaurant was a simple affair, but Josephine enjoyed it immensely. Samuel was more relaxed than he had been at the mayor's dinner party, and their conversation flowed naturally from topic to topic. He told her about his plans to expand his herd in the spring, and she shared stories about her more memorable students. "The youngest Patterson boy, Thomas, you met him, has a remarkable mind for mathematics," she said as they lingered over coffee. "He completes calculations in his head that would take me minutes to work out on paper." "You sound proud," Samuel observed. "I am," Josephine admitted. "Of all of them, really, they're eager to learn despite the challenges of frontier life." "And what about you?" Samuel asked, his expression growing more serious. "Are you happy here, Josephine? Is it what you hoped for when you left Boston?" She considered the question carefully. "It's different from what I expected," she said finally. "Harder in some ways, easier in others. But yes, I am happy here, happier than I've been in a long time." Samuel nodded, satisfaction evident in his eyes. "I'm glad to hear it." As the evening drew to a close, he walked her back to her cottage. The night was clear but cold, stars glittering overhead in a way they never seemed to in the city. "When will you return to town?" Josephine asked as they paused at her gate. "A month, most likely," Samuel replied. "Unless." "Unless," she prompted when he didn't continue. "Unless you might consider visiting the ranch before then," he said, a hint of uncertainty in his voice. "When school isn't in session, of course. Perhaps on a Saturday. It's a long ride, but the weather is improving and I could come fetch you." Josephine's heart quickened at the thought. "I would like that very much," she said softly. "Next Saturday, perhaps?" Samuel's face brightened. "Next Saturday it is. I'll come for you at dawn if that's not too early." "Not at all," she assured him. "I'll be ready." They stood in silence for a moment, both aware of the deepening connection between them but hesitant to acknowledge it directly. Finally, Samuel reached out and took her hand, his touch gentle but sure. "Good night, Josephine," he said, his voice low. "Until Saturday." "Good night, Samuel," she replied, reluctantly withdrawing her hand. "Safe journey home." She watched from her doorway as he walked away, his tall figure eventually disappearing into the darkness. Only then did she enter her cottage, already counting the days until Saturday. The next few days passed with agonizing slowness. Josephine threw herself into her teaching duties with even more enthusiasm than usual, trying to distract herself from thoughts of the upcoming visit. Her students noticed her heightened energy, responding with increased engagement that made the lessons particularly successful. By Friday afternoon, even the usually oblivious Mayor Holloway had noticed something different about her. "You seem particularly cheerful today, Miss Campbell," he observed when he stopped by the school to discuss the upcoming spring festival. "Sweetwater must be agreeing with you." "It is indeed, Mayor," Josephine replied with a small smile. "I feel quite at home here now, Mrs. Patterson, who had accompanied the mayor to discuss the festival decorations, gave Josephine a shrewd look. "I heard Mr. Xanders was in town earlier this week," she said casually. "Did he happen to call on you?" Josephine kept her expression neutral, though she felt a flush creeping into her cheeks. "Yes, we had dinner at the hotel. Mr. Xanders was kind enough to check on my well-being, given the circumstances of our first meeting." "How thoughtful, Mrs. Patterson said, exchanging a meaningful glance with the mayor. "Samuel Xanders is a fine man, keeps to himself mostly, but he's well respected in these parts. Built that ranch of his from nothing, they say." "So I understand," Josephine said, deliberately changing the subject. "Now about the decorations for the festival." When Saturday finally dawned, Josephine was already awake and dressed, too excited to sleep past the first hint of light in the eastern sky. She had packed a small bag with essentials for the day and had laid out her warmest cloak and gloves. The knock on her door came precisely at dawn. When she opened it, Samuel stood there, looking slightly windblown but undeniably handsome in his usual practical attire. "Good morning," he greeted her, his eyes taking in her ready appearance with approval. "You're prepared, I see." "I am," she confirmed, reaching for her cloak, "and eager to see this ranch I've heard so much about." Samuel helped her with her cloak, his hands lingering briefly on her shoulders. "It's nothing grand," he warned, "just a simple homestead, but it's mine." "That makes it special," Josephine said sincerely. The ride to the ranch took several hours, but it passed quickly as they talked. Samuel pointed out landmarks along the way, a rock formation that local tribes considered sacred, a creek that never froze even in the depths of winter, a distant mountain range that marked the edge of his grazing lands. As they crested a small rise, the ranch came into view below them. It was indeed modest, a solid log house with a stone chimney, a large barn, a few smaller outbuildings, and corrals for the horses and cattle. But there was something immediately appealing about its sturdy simplicity and the way it sat naturally in the landscape, as if it belonged there. "Here we are," Samuel said, a note of pride in his voice. "Xanders Ranch, not much to look at, but it's home." "It's wonderful," Josephine said, meaning it. "I can see why you love it here." As they approached, a border collie came bounding out to meet them, barking enthusiastically. "That's Daisy," Samuel explained with a fond smile. "Best cattle dog in the territory and my constant companion." Daisy greeted Samuel with obvious adoration, then turned her attention to Josephine, sniffing curiously at the newcomer before apparently deciding she was acceptable. "She likes you," Samuel observed as Daisy trotted alongside the wagon. "She's not usually so friendly with strangers." "I'm flattered," Josephine laughed, watching the dog's antics. Samuel helped her down from the wagon when they reached the house, his hands strong and sure at her waist. The brief contact sent a flutter through her stomach, but she tried to maintain her composure as he led her inside. The interior of the house was as practical as the exterior, one large room that served as both kitchen and living area, with doors leading off to what Josephine presumed were bedrooms. A substantial stone fireplace dominated one wall, currently hosting a cheerful blaze that took the chill from the air. "It's not much," Samuel said again, watching her reaction closely, "but it's comfortable enough." "It's perfect," Josephine assured him, moving to warm her hands by the fire. Exactly what a ranch house should be. Relief flickered across his face and he smiled. "I'm glad you think so. Are you hungry? I thought we might have lunch, then I could show you around the property if you'd like." "I'd like that very much," Josephine said. "And yes, I am rather hungry after the ride." Samuel proved to be a surprisingly competent cook, preparing a simple but satisfying meal of venison stew that had been simmering on the stove and fresh bread that he admitted a neighbor woman baked for him weekly. "Mrs. Jenkins from the next ranch over," he explained as they ate at the sturdy wooden table. "She thinks I'll starve without proper bread, so she sends her son over with a loaf every Monday." "That's very kind of her," Josephine said, buttering another piece of the excellent bread. "People look out for each other out here," Samuel said with a shrug. "It's necessary for survival. When her husband broke his leg last winter, I helped with their cattle until he was back on his feet." After lunch, true to his word, Samuel took her on a tour of the ranch. They visited the barn first, where he introduced her to his horses, 4 sturdy quarter horses for working cattle and 2 draft horses for pulling the wagon and plow. "This is Copper," he said, stroking the nose of a handsome chestnut gelding, "my best cutting horse. And over there is Midnight, she's the fastest. Those 2 are Thunder and Storm brothers from the same dam." Josephine listened attentively as he named each animal, clearly hearing the pride and affection in his voice. These weren't just working animals to him, they were partners and in some ways friends. Next, he showed her the cattle in the winter pasture, a small but healthy herd of Herefords that he was gradually building up. "I started with just 10 head, he explained. "Now I'm up to 50 with more calves expected in the spring." Throughout the tour, Josephine was struck by Samuel's quiet competence and the obvious care he took with his land and animals. This was a man who had built something meaningful through hard work and perseverance, who took pride in what he had accomplished without being boastful. As the afternoon waned, they walked to a small rise behind the house that offered a view of the entire ranch and the surrounding countryside. The February sun was beginning to sink toward the western mountains, casting a golden light over the snow-covered landscape. "It's beautiful," Josephine said softly, gazing out at the vista before them. "Yes, it is," Samuel agreed, though when she glanced at him, she found he wasn't looking at the view but at her. Their eyes met, and Josephine felt a rush of warmth that had nothing to do with the exertion of their walk. For a moment they stood in silence, something unspoken passing between them. Then Samuel cleared his throat and looked away. "We should head back," he said. "It'll be dark soon, and I need to get you back to town." Disappointment flickered through Josephine. "Of course," she said, trying to keep it from her voice. "Thank you for showing me your home. It's truly lovely." "You're welcome here anytime," Samuel said, his voice quiet but sincere. "I mean that, Josephine." The ride back to Sweetwater was quieter than the journey out had been, both of them lost in their own thoughts. As they approached the town, Josephine found herself wishing the day hadn't gone by so quickly. "Will I see you again before your next supply run?" she asked as they neared her cottage. Samuel glanced at her, something shifting in his expression. "Would you like to?" "Yes," she said simply, deciding that honesty was the best approach. "Very much." A slow smile spread across his face. "Then yes, you will. I can find reasons to come to town more often than once a month." When they reached her cottage, Samuel helped her down from the wagon, his hands lingering at her waist slightly longer than strictly necessary. Josephine looked up at him, her heart racing as she recognized the intent in his eyes. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, Samuel leaned down. Their lips met in a gentle, tentative kiss that nevertheless sent a jolt of electricity through Josephine's entire body. It was brief, just a moment of connection, but when they parted, both were breathing a little faster. "Good night, Josephine," Samuel murmured, still standing close enough that she could feel the warmth of his breath. "Thank you for visiting my home. Thank you for showing it to me," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Good night, Samuel." She watched from her doorway as he drove away, her fingers touching her lips where his had been moments before. Something had changed between them today, a step had been taken that couldn't be undone, and Josephine found she had no desire to undo it. True to his word, Samuel found reasons to visit Sweetwater more frequently over the following weeks. Sometimes it was legitimate business selling cattle to the hotel restaurant, helping with repairs at the church after a strong storm, but often it was transparent that he had come simply to see Josephine. The townspeople noticed, of course. In a place as small as Sweetwater, little escaped observation or comment, but rather than disapproving, most seemed pleased by the developing relationship. Samuel Xanders had been alone too long, they said. It was good for him to finally show interest in someone. "He's a fine man, Mrs. Holloway told Josephine one afternoon as they worked together preparing decorations for the spring festival. "Quiet but solid. You could do far worse, my dear." Josephine blushed but didn't deny the implication. "He's been very kind to me." "Kindness is important," the older woman agreed with a knowing smile. "But I suspect there's more than kindness in the way he looks at you." By April, when the snow had melted and the first wildflowers were beginning to appear on the prairie, Samuel and Josephine had settled into a comfortable routine. He visited town at least once a week, usually timing his arrival for the end of the school day so he could walk Josephine home. Often, they would have dinner together at the hotel or occasionally at Mrs. Holloway's home, where the mayor's wife had taken it upon herself to chaperone their courtship. On weekends, when the weather was fair, Josephine would accompany Samuel back to the ranch, helping with whatever tasks needed doing, gathering eggs from the small flock of chickens he had recently acquired, tending the kitchen garden he had started with seeds she brought from town, even learning to ride one of the gentler horses so they could explore the property together. It was on one such weekend in late April, as they sat together on the porch after a day of working in the garden, that Samuel finally put into words what had been growing between them for months. "I never expected this," he said quietly, looking out over his land as the setting sun painted the sky in shades of pink and gold. "When I came west, I thought I'd live out my days alone. I was content with that, or at least I thought I was." Josephine turned to study his profile, waiting for him to continue. "Then I found you shivering in my barn," he said, a smile tugging at his lips, "and everything changed. For me as well," Josephine admitted softly. "I came west looking for independence, for a fresh start I wasn't looking for." "For this?" Samuel turned to face her fully, taking her hands in his. "And what is this, Josephine? What would you call what's between us?" Her heart raced as she met his steady gaze. "Love," she said simply. "I believe it's love, Samuel." The smile that broke across his face was like sunrise after a long night. "Yes," he agreed, his voice rough with emotion. "That's exactly what it is." He took a deep breath, then continued, "I love you, Josephine Campbell. I think I've loved you since that first morning, when you insisted on sleeping on my sofa rather than taking my bed." Josephine laughed softly at the memory, even as tears pricked at her eyes. "I love you too, Samuel, though I think it took me until our first dinner in Sweetwater to realize it." His hands tightened around hers. "I want to ask you something," he said, suddenly serious. "And I want you to know that you can say no. Your teaching position, your independence, I understand how important those things are to you." Josephine felt her breath catch. What is it you want to ask me, Samuel? Slowly, never taking his eyes from hers, Samuel slipped from the porch bench to one knee before her. Josephine Campbell, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife, of making this ranch your home and making me the happiest man in the Wyoming territory? For a moment, Josephine couldn't speak past the lump in her throat, then the words came in a rush. Yes, she said, her vision blurring with happy tears. Yes, Samuel, I will marry you. He surged up to capture her lips in a kiss that was both tender and passionate, his arms encircling her as if he never intended to let her go. When they finally parted, both breathing heavily, Samuel rested his forehead against hers. I don't have a ring yet, he admitted. I wanted to be sure of your answer first, but I'll ride to Cheyenne next week and find the most beautiful one they have. I don't need a ring, Josephine assured him, her hands framing his face. I just need you, and this home we'll build together. They were married on the first day of June, 1879, in the small white church in Sweetwater. The entire town turned out for the occasion, along with ranchers from miles around who had come to know and respect Samuel over the years. Josephine wore a simple white dress that Mrs. Holloway and several other ladies from town had helped her make, with wildflowers in her hair instead of a veil. Samuel, looking somewhat uncomfortable but undeniably handsome in a new suit purchased specifically for the occasion, couldn't take his eyes off her as she walked down the aisle on Mayor Holloway's arm. The ceremony was brief but heartfelt, with Reverend Thomas speaking eloquently about the foundation of trust and respect upon which Samuel and Josephine had built their love. When they exchanged vows, Josephine's voice was clear and steady, while Samuel's was rough with emotion. I now pronounce you husband and wife, the Reverend declared to the packed church. What God has joined together, let no man put asunder. The celebration afterward was the largest Sweetwater had seen in years. Tables were set up in the town square, laden with food contributed by every household. There was music from a local fiddler and a banjo player from the next town over, dancing that continued well into the evening, and enough goodwill to make even the most cynical observer believe in true love. As the sun began to set, Samuel and Josephine slipped away from the festivities, climbing into the wagon that would take them back to the ranch, their home now. They had discussed whether Josephine should continue teaching, and she had decided to finish out the school year, which ended in just 3 weeks. After that, she would focus on the ranch, though she had already arranged to tutor several children during the summer and perhaps take on a more limited role at the school in the fall. The journey to the ranch that evening was filled with a mixture of excitement and nervousness on both their parts. Though they had spent countless hours together over the past months, they had maintained a propriety that befitted their courtship. Now, as husband and wife, they were entering new territory. When they arrived, Samuel helped Josephine down from the wagon, then surprised her by sweeping her into his arms to carry her across the threshold. Welcome home, Mrs. Xanders, he said softly as he set her down in the main room of the house, their house now. Josephine's heart swelled at the name and the sight of the home they would share. Samuel had made several improvements in anticipation of their marriage: new curtains at the windows, a larger bed in the main bedroom, a comfortable rocking chair by the fire that he had ordered all the way from Denver. It's perfect, she whispered, turning to face him. Everything is perfect, the nervousness of the journey dissolved in the warmth of their shared love and trust. That night they discovered each other fully for the first time, their passion tempered by tenderness, and the deep emotional connection that had grown between them since that cold January night when Samuel had found Josephine shivering in his barn. In the quiet hours before dawn, as they lay entwined in the new bed that now belonged to both of them, Samuel traced gentle patterns on Josephine's bare shoulder. I never thought I could be this happy, he confessed, his voice barely audible in the darkness. After the war, I was so lost. Coming west was about escaping as much as it was about building something new. Josephine propped herself up on one elbow to look down at him, her hair falling around them like a curtain. And now, Samuel reached up to brush a strand of hair behind her ear, his touch reverent. Now I feel like I've found what I was looking for all along, even though I didn't know I was looking for it. For you." "I feel the same way," Josephine said, leaning down to kiss him softly. "As if everything that happened, my father's death, losing our home, even being abandoned by that horrible stagecoach driver, was leading me here to you." "Remind me to send that driver a thank you note," Samuel murmured against her lips, drawing a surprised laugh from Josephine. "I'm not sure he deserves our gratitude," she pointed out. "Perhaps not," Samuel conceded, "but I can't regret anything that brought you to my barn that night." As spring turned to summer and summer to fall, Samuel and Josephine settled into married life with a joy that seemed to deepen with each passing day. The ranch prospered under their joint care, Josephine bringing her organizational skills and education to complement Samuel's practical knowledge and hard work. They expanded the garden, added more chickens and even a few dairy cows, and began planning for additions to the house that would accommodate the family they hoped to have someday. Josephine continued to tutor several children from neighboring ranches, finding fulfillment in teaching without the full-time commitment of the school position. The winter of 1879-1880 was milder than the previous year, for which both were grateful. On the anniversary of their first meeting that cold January night when Samuel had found Josephine shivering in his barn, they celebrated with a special dinner and an exchange of simple gifts. Samuel gave Josephine a beautiful leather-bound journal, knowing her love of writing. Inside the cover he had inscribed, "For my beloved wife, whose presence makes every day a blessing." Josephine's gift to Samuel was a hand-knitted sweater made secretly during the hours he was out working with the cattle. But she had another gift as well, news that made his eyes widen with wonder and joy. "A baby," he repeated after she told him, his voice barely above a whisper. "We're going to have a baby," Josephine nodded, tears of happiness glistening in her eyes. "In July, Dr. Harmon says." "Our family is beginning, Samuel." He gathered her into his arms, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. "I love you," he murmured against her hair. "Both of you already." That night, as they lay together in their bed listening to the winter wind outside, Samuel's hand resting protectively over the still flat plane of Josephine's stomach, she thought back to the desperate young woman who had stumbled through the snow seeking shelter just 1 year earlier. "I was so afraid that night," she said softly. "I truly thought I might die in the cold." "So did I when I found you," Samuel admitted. "You were so pale, so still at first. For a moment I feared I was too late." "But you weren't," Josephine said, placing her hand over his. "You found me and you gave me your coat and you saved my life." "And you saved mine," Samuel replied, pulling her closer. "In a different way, perhaps, but just as surely." Outside, snow began to fall, soft and gentle against the window panes. But inside, there was only warmth and love and the promise of a future brighter than either of them had dared to dream. Their daughter, Sarah Elizabeth Xanders, was born on a warm July morning in 1880, with Dr. Harmon in attendance and Mrs. Holloway providing experienced assistance. She had Samuel's dark hair and Josephine's green eyes, and from the moment they first held her, both parents were completely besotted. "She's perfect," Samuel whispered, cradling his tiny daughter with hands that had branded cattle and built fences but now touched the infant with infinite gentleness. "Absolutely perfect. She is," Josephine agreed, exhausted but radiant with new motherhood. "Our little miracle." The years that followed brought more joy than either had thought possible. The ranch prospered, expanding to become one of the most successful operations in the territory. 2 more children joined the family, Thomas James in 1882 and Emma Grace in 1885, completing the home that had once seemed so empty. Josephine never returned to full-time teaching, but she never truly stopped being a teacher either. She taught their children at home until they were old enough to attend school in Sweetwater, and she continued to tutor neighboring children. When the town built a small library in 1890, she was the natural choice to oversee it, spending 2 days a week sharing her love of books with the growing community. Samuel, meanwhile, became a respected figure in the territory, serving on the Cattlemen's Association and eventually as a county commissioner. The shy, solitary rancher who had once avoided town whenever possible became known for his fair judgment and quiet leadership. But through it all, through the triumphs and challenges that life inevitably brought, their greatest joy remained each other. The love that had begun on a frigid January night when a cowboy found a young woman shivering in his barn and covered her with his coat, until morning only deepened with the passing years. And on cold winter nights, even decades later, when their children were grown with families of their own, Samuel and Josephine would often sit together by the fire in the ranch house that had become a true home, his arm around her shoulders, her head resting against him, and remember how it all began. "Do you ever regret it?" Samuel asked on one such night as they celebrated 40 years of marriage. "Leaving Boston, coming west, all the hardships you faced." Josephine looked up at him, at the face she had loved for more than half her life, older now, lined with the evidence of years lived fully, but still with the same steady strength, the same kindness in his eyes. "Not for a single moment," she said with absolute certainty. "Everything led me to you, to our children, to this life we've built together. How could I possibly regret that?" Samuel leaned down to kiss her, a gesture as familiar and necessary as breathing after all their years together. "I thank God every day for leading you to my barn that night," he murmured. "And I thank God for the cowboy who found me shivering and covered me with his coat," Josephine replied softly. "It was the beginning of everything good in my life." Outside, snow fell gently on the Wyoming landscape, not unlike the night they had first met. But inside the ranch house that had witnessed their love story from its earliest chapters, there was only warmth and the quiet joy of a love that had stood the test of time. And in the gentle glow of the firelight, with the weight of shared memories enfolding them like the coat that had once saved Josephine's life, they knew with absolute certainty that they had found in each other the truest shelter of all, a love that would endure through every season, until the very end of their days.